So on this episode and this series, we get to review the green jobs that are available in the emerging sectors that are potentially high in jobs in terms of the continent of Africa. So far, we've reviewed the agricultural sector as well as the energy sector, and today we get to review the transport sector. What exactly are the jobs in the transport sector? My name is Sellah Bogonko, co-founder and CEO Jacobs Ladder Africa, and this is Green Jobs Africa. So when we take a look at the transport sector, one would be asking, how exactly is it a green jobs provider or source of green jobs? Well, what we do need to be able to know is that there are certain facts that make it a high emitter on the one hand, but a potentially high job creator on the other hand when it comes to the African continent. So let's start off with the emissions or the facts and statistics that we need to know about the transport sector. Now, when it comes to transport, there are obviously different modes of transport. You have, whether it's the ships or the boats, you have cars, you have trains, you have aeroplanes, etc. All of them use fossil fuels. And as we said earlier, fossil fuels are the highest reason or the highest emitter when it comes to carbon emissions. And so if an industry is a high consumer of fossil fuels, then obviously it does contribute significantly to carbon emissions. And so on the African continent, when it comes to the carbon emissions that come from the transport sector, we do need to know that obviously it's because of the mass movement that happens. And what we know as well is that when you use older vehicles, they consume a lot more and they burn more inefficiently compared to the newer vehicles. Africa is home to second-hand vehicles for the most part. We do not manufacture. We only assemble the vehicles, and for the most part, the people that own vehicles are actually owning or own second-hand vehicles, which means that they burn a lot of fuel inefficiently, resulting to carbon emissions. That's in terms of the individual cars. But when it comes to movement, you also don't have the newer, more efficient or green-based infrastructure like trains and other forms like metros and all that. So we end up relying on older forms of infrastructure like our train system, for example, for the ones that have it, resulting to, again, significant emissions because of the inefficiency of the engines that are used. While the globe is discussing about e-vehicles and e-bikes, we are only getting into that space in terms of as an emerging sector and as an emerging discussion. So a motorbike that consumes fossil fuels, in this case petrol or diesel, obviously contributes to carbon emissions. And in the recent past, especially over the last 5 years, those numbers have increased because there's been a huge influx of motor vehicles or motorbikes rather on the continent. It's a good source of creation of jobs in the sense of the riders that do deliveries as well as transport for the individuals. And it's a low-cost form of transport and which addresses a need when it comes to the market or when it comes to the kind of environment that we're in Africa. So the more motorbikes are there on the continent, the more contribution they contribute quite a bit when it comes to carbon emissions. And as you would remember, during the Africa Climate Summit, there was a lot of hype and a lot of excitement around e-bikes and e-vehicles or e-mobility in general. And that's an area that Africa is seriously looking at least many of the countries are seriously looking at when it comes to e-vehicles on the continent. But let's just go back to the challenges that come with it or the pitfalls that we need to look out for as a continent before we get into the jobs that are potentially available in the sector. One of them is we do need an infrastructure. For those of us who are readers, or perhaps you've read this book, if you haven't, please grab a hold of it. And this is a book that is called Israel. It's about Israel and it's called The Startup Nation. And in that book, there's a story about how Israel adopted e-mobility when the rest of the world was not embracing it. And one of the things they had to grapple with is, do we create the infrastructure first or do we create the e-vehicles? Because obviously to get companies that had traditionally relied on fossil fuel engines to transition into electric vehicles would take quite a bit of convincing, money, investment. It wasn't a thing at the time. And so there was a lot of back and forth when it came to designing the winning product, or designing the winning sort of like a system that would enable that transition from fossil fuel dependency in terms of vehicles to the e-vehicles. And one of the things that they had to do is test it around a certain region, because obviously you can't drive, whether it's an e-bike or an e-vehicle, without charging it. So how do you create the infrastructure that enables for people to move confidently from one country to the other, from one place to the other, knowing that at the point when they do need to charge, just the way you'll need to refuel, you do have that infrastructure in place. So it's a huge investment, not just in the vehicles or the e-bikes in terms of shipping them into the continent, but we do need to think long term when it comes to the strategy around the infrastructure that is required and how we can leverage on existing infrastructure to be able to provide this solution. And then the other thing when it comes to e-mobility is that many of the things that are required, for example, the batteries and the solars or any other system that is required, is actually dependent or is manufactured using certain kinds of critical minerals. You have nickel, you have cobalt, of which we have large deposits as an African continent. But the challenge is that we do not manufacture those products on the continent, which means that by the time that they land in the continent, whether in form of already existing as part of the product, in terms of an e-bike, for example, or an e-vehicle, it already is multiple times over the costs that it would have been had it been manufactured on the continent. So even from a logical or strategic perspective as a continent, we do need to think about in the process of creating jobs in the mobility, on the e-mobility sector, there are many other factors that we need to consider. How do we increase the production or the value addition on the critical minerals on the continent, as has been championed by several heads of state in this last 1 year, as we've been discussing about increasing the value addition on the continent, especially when it comes to critical minerals. How do we make sure that that is another source of providing green jobs for our young people? It's a brilliant idea, but it does need to be thought through and strategically so. The other thing that we do need to think about, for example, is the training, the skills that are required. In the recent past, after the unveiling of the e-bikes in several countries, there's been a lot of feedback, especially from the users. The amount of money required to buy an e-bike at the upfront, the capital required is significant, which becomes a barrier when it comes to entry into that space. And even when there's been provisions, for example, of supplier funding, which means that there's a bit of loans, for example, that are given to young people who want to buy the bikes, or the riders who want to buy the bikes, there's already been an influx of the fossil fuel ones. The question is, how are those deposited again, or how are those recycled, or what do we do with those existing ones on the continent? That has to be thought through as well, because it could lead to other repercussions in terms of increasing carbon emissions, depending on how they are disposed. Another factor that we do need to consider is the infrastructure, the investment required, the marketing, the education for the riders, the assurance when it comes to insurance, for example. One of the things that has been spoken is that it's cheaper in terms of running the fossil fuel dependent e-mobility or e-vehicles or e-bikes. It's cheaper when it comes to making sure that the source of electricity, because all of them are charged using some form of electricity, but the source of electricity has to be cheap or manageable for it to make sense. Because ultimately, if the cost of electricity is high, it will definitely be passed on to the consumer. So those are the things we need to know from a macro level. Thank you so much for hanging out with me. Thank you for staying tuned. Thank you for your feedback. Should you have questions or comments or anything that you want to share with us, or even just ideas that you want someone else to think through with you, we're happy to point you in the right direction or to help you think through the ideas so that you can be able to move from an idea to an actual substantive product or solution or service. My name is Sellah Bogonko, co-founder and CEO Jacobs Ladder Africa, and this is Green Jobs Africa.